and little explanation. Abram, Sarai, and their family had only recently settled in the land of Haran when God showed up and announced a change of plans. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you. The Holy One provided precious few details, just this: it's time to go. And apparently, they went. Abram and Sarai and a few members of their household walked away from everything they knew into the wilderness to go, God only knew where. This is in itself remarkable. And I think it also illustrates how this thing we call often unfolds. More like a compass heading than a detailed roadmap, setting a course rather than charting an exact route. About once a month, members and friends of Saugatuck Church get together at a local eatery or on the beach when the weather's nice for conversation on some big question. This week, our theme was call. We call the group Theology on Tap. And one of the first things that we noted about call is it's not something that most non-clergy talk about. Unless you attended Catholic school, in which case you may have been asked whether you had a call to be a priest or to be a nun. As for me, I have been immersed in the language of call since I attended graduate school. First as a student, and then as a director of admissions at Chicago Theological Seminary, I learned to pose this question over and over. It was a question that felt in turns exhilarating and a bit terrifying. Is God calling me or you to ministry? Does God have something in mind for me, for you? During my years as the director of admissions at CTS, I listened to scores of people describe encounters like the one faced by Abram and Sarai. A summons to walk away from something familiar in order to go somewhere that God had not yet revealed. I met countless women, mostly in their 40s and 50s, second career seminarians, who had begun life in some other profession because they had been told, directly or indirectly, that as women they couldn't possibly have been called to ordained ministry. And yet they felt an inner tug that persisted, sometimes over decades, until finally they walked away from careers in law or education or business to become students again, not knowing where it would lead, just knowing that God had led them to the doors of the seminary. I also listened to young people fresh out of college who were deeply suspicious of the institutions that had failed them over the course of the 1990s. Think hanging chads, clergy sexual abuse scandals, subprime loans. Many of them walked through the doors of the seminary practically holding their noses at the prospect of becoming ordained clergy for the institutional church, but they were determined to be agents of change and convinced that God had something in mind for them. So there they were. What began as shop talk among all those ministry candidates has become, for me, a much broader and richly compelling question addressed to every one of us. Where is God calling you? And where is God calling us together? If the folks gathered for Theology on Tap are any indication, you may never have asked this particular question in reference to your own life and work. Maybe you've thought about what gifts you have and how to use them, or wondered where you could make a difference in the world. Or maybe life has unfolded almost without you thinking about it. We may encounter roadblocks, navigate tragedy, experience seasons flush with success. But how often do we consider any of this in terms of God's purpose? Well, this morning, I invite you to take this question about call and try it on for size, whether or not you've done so before. Has God called you in a particular way? And how would you know? Is it always obvious? As God banging on a door and saying, "Pack your bags"? I think sometimes we do experience a holy tug, or even a forceful push that leads us to make big changes. It's like the Reverend Tracy Blackman, whose ministry took a dramatic turn after Michael Brown was shot and killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri, one town over from the neighborhood where she served as a local pastor. Reverend Blackman felt compelled to respond in the wake of that tragedy. And so now she is the executive minister of justice and local church ministry for our denomination, the United Church of Christ, speaking out prophetically and urging all our churches to speak and work against racism and economic injustice. Sometimes the call is, in fact, a dramatic one. But there doesn't always have to be that one pivotal moment. Call can also refer to our overall sense of purpose, as in, I feel called to be a parent, or a healthcare provider, an artist, or a social activist. Discerning a call may be a matter of listening deeply to our own life and asking, how do I become the person that God intends me to be? Let your life speak, in the words of educator and Quaker Parker Palmer. Let your life speak. Now, to be clear, discerning call from God is not just about finding my bliss or pursuing my personal passion. Every call is an invitation to collaborate with God in some way, large or small, toward building the beloved community that God envisions. I also suspect that call almost always requires us to take a risk, maybe even make a sacrifice. Leave something behind to follow where God would lead, even when you have no idea how it will all turn out. I know this isn't the first time that I've quoted the famous observation by theologian Frederick Beeger, but it's worth repeating. He says that call is the place where my deep joy and the world's deep hunger meet. And so, to sum up, you may be able to recognize a call by asking, does it give me joy? Does it meet a need or respond to that deep hunger? In other words, might it serve some divine purpose, large or small? And third, does it require that we take a risk? Joy, need, risk. Now, if you have been hanging out at Saugatuck Church over the last 6.5 years that I have been with you, you have probably heard me pose the question, where is God calling us? Here at Saugatuck Church, I keep asking it because I think it's a critical question, and the responses may well shift and change over time. I also think it takes time to discern our purpose. Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, says, do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? Do you have the patience to wait until your mud settles and the water is clear? Waiting is part of discerning call. But I don't think it's a passive waiting. Like Abram and Sarai, who went before they knew the details, I think we walk ourselves into our purpose. That is, sometimes we discover by doing. Doing and then looking back and saying, how was that? Did it make our hearts sing? Did it cast more light than heat? Did it stir up joy or deepen faith or provide healing? Did it contribute in some way to building up God's beloved community? If the answer is yes, well then it may have God's fingerprints all over it. With all that in mind, here's what I see. Here are some of the ways that I believe God is calling Saugatuck Church. See if this sounds like the church you are getting to know. I believe that we are called to extend an extravagant welcome, to bear witness to God's love and grace, not just with those words I use to start worship, but with our actions. In a culture where too many people regard the church as judgmental, exclusive, patriarchal, homophobic, and yes, stuffy, I believe that we are called to make God's love and grace vivid, tangible, embodied, and to do everything in our power to dismantle the bigotries that diminish the human spirit. I also believe that we are called to nurture the faith lives of young people, to help them, and indeed all of us, to discover and express their God-created true selves, to serve others, to honor difference, and to trust God's love. I believe, too, that we are called to be a community church, open not only to those who routinely worship here on a Sunday morning, but to all those seeking community, recovery, or connection. If you are relatively new to Saugatuck Church, you may or may not know that we are host to dozens of 12-step groups, a weekly retired men's group, the Wise Men, a nursery school, and Ableists, a program for young adults with developmental disabilities, all of those folks in our building every week. Later this fall, we're going to open up this space to Staples High School so that they can hold their fall choral concert right here in this sanctuary. And last week, several members of the Westport community gathered downstairs for an event they called Voterate, where residents organized to send care packages and absentee ballot applications to college students. And friends, all of that is just for starters. This church has always been an anchor in Westport. And so I've been wondering lately whether there are fresh ways that we might live out that role. If you look at the back of the sanctuary, go ahead, you can look back, I don't mind. That string of prayers, we created those prayers on Welcome Sunday, invited people to write their prayers for all God's creatures and for the world. If you take time later on to go up and look closely at the prayers that are included, you will notice how many of them are prayers for peace, guidance, and reconciliation in the face of conflict. Friends, we are living in a time marked by deep division. And I have heard you over and over ask for help to navigate those rifts. So I've been wondering, might Saugatuck Church, located in the heart of Westport, with a history of a wide open welcome, be called to be a space in which we can learn and teach tools for engaging and exploring those differences with something like grace? Not just for ourselves, but for our wider community. Might we be called to create spaces in which to listen more closely to one another, to learn firsthand about the impact of racism, or sexism, or Islamophobia, to learn also how to stay in relationship with people whose views do not mirror our own, to discover how we might be enriched by those differences rather than divided. I'd like to know what you think, what you discern when you look around. How does that sound? I'd like to know what you hear God whispering in our collective ear. Where do you see our gifts and graces? How are they most urgently needed? How might God be enlisting us to collaborate toward the building up of God's beloved community? Friends, whatever God has in store, you can be sure that it's not a short-term enterprise. God promised Abram and Sarai that they would become the parents of a great nation. Oh yes, but at 75 they were barren, and at 90 that was still true. It would take generations for that vision to unfold. The point is, they had a critical role to play, and so do we. Like our ancestors in the faith, we have been blessed with gifts and resources and a church community and a God to walk with us. We have been blessed, but friends, not for our own sakes. We have been blessed to be a blessing in this room, in this community, in God's whole world. May it be so. Amen.